the question that seems to be on everybody's lips nowadays as we watch the improbable yet now seemingly inevitable rise of Donald J. Trump is it fascism we're looking at, or is it something else? Our next guest has an answer to that question. She has certainly concluded for herself because her new piece is entitled Sorry Folks, It's Fascism. Kathleen J. Frydl is a historian. She studies U.S. state power, policies, and the institutions that shape American life. She's the author of The Drug Wars in America, 1970 to 1973, and the GI Bill. She joins us now to talk about fascism and whatever else comes up. Kathleen, thanks for coming back on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You know, Sorry Folks, It's Fascism sounds like a sitcom. You know, it's a name that could be used in so many different ways, a game show. But but of course, it's not a game at all. You are saying, you know, we've been hearing historians tell us now for months that whatever we think of Donald Trump, he's not a fascist. We're not looking at incipient fascism in this country, but you've reached a different conclusion.
I have, and a few others have as well. I think that the mistake that my friends and colleagues make when they conclude that Trump is not a fascist is that they compare him to fascism when it was in its full flower. You know, when all of the dastardly deeds of Hitler and Mussolini were well known to the world. And I think the real comparison lies in the years of 1920 to 1933. That is when Hitler was just growing in his power and coalition building. That's the key moment of time that we should be thinking about when we think about whether or not Donald Trump is a fascist. You know, has Donald Trump announced a plan to exterminate 11 million people? You know, no. Will he? Probably not. But that doesn't make him, the fact that he's a pale comparison to Hitler doesn't, you know, that's no consolation. That doesn't make him any less fascist in my eyes. So I think if you look at the general patterns of his campaign up until this moment, you can make a very compelling case that he's fascist. And I did think about the title of that piece a little bit. It's a disarmingly conversational title. And I did that on purpose because I think we've been disarmingly conversational about Donald Trump. And what we're seeing is the emergence of something truly dangerous.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And you know, I brought that up. I was regretting as I did that if I sounded a little too flippant about it, because obviously, obviously it is a deadly serious issue. And I think, when you say that Donald Trump right now is at best a pale imitation of a Hitler or a Mussolini, I think one of your points is that at a comparable point in their own careers, Hitler and Mussolini were a pale imitation of what they eventually became, right?
Absolutely. And, I think there's a lot of reasons why we've resisted this comparison. I think one of them, and I say this in the piece, one of them is a very good reason. And that is, we don't want to make light of something that deserves to be treated with dead seriousness, So I think people don't want to make these kinds of comparisons for fear of treating history cavalierly. And I think that that's really important. But I also think people have resisted this comparison because there are certain things that Donald Trump says that they like. He calls the war in Iraq a mistake. He opposes the TPP. And I think it's really important for people to remember that had they been around the Weimar Republic in, the late 1920s, Hitler would have been saying some things that they like. Hitler denounced corporatist cartels. Hitler denounced the Versailles Treaty and the punishing reparations that were imposed on Germany. So, I don't view that as, he's a fascist in some ways and an economic populist in others. Mm-hmm. Hitler's first programmatic priority was full employment. These kinds of economic populisms have always been embedded in the fascist appeal.
Yeah, and I think there were comparable elements of economic populism and Mussolini's agenda too, right? I mean, I think that I mean, you're the historian, but as I recall, he certainly made popular appeals as well. And I guess what I'm struggling with here is the definition of fascism, because I think different historians and different political scientists have slightly different ways of framing what fascism even is. So, what's yours?
So the people who have said that Donald Trump is not a fascist tend to include imperial expansion as a necessary component to fascism. I've put that to one side. We have no idea what Donald Trump would do as president, and Hitler didn't advertise anything beyond living room or Lebensraum for Germans. He didn't advertise a program of world war either. So my definition relies more on basically patterns of um, both of the campaigns. And these are not, these patterns are not alien to fascist historians. First and foremost is this idea of national humiliation and disgrace,
Mm-hmm.
and the language of machismo that tends to accompany it. There are strong leaders and strong countries, and then there are weak leaders and weak countries. This kind of language was suffused in Nazi policy. And to be quite honest with you, and I don't mean to be flip when I say this, Hitler had more reason to feel that Germany had been humiliated on the international stage than Donald Trump does today. And that's a point that kind of, I don't know, goes unnoticed. So I think that's, for me, the first and foremost. Donald Trump's campaign slogan is literally "Make America Great Again." I mean, national humiliation is at the core of his message and his appeal. Second, and equally important in my eyes, is the racial and religious demagoguery that we're seeing. And I think that that's a point that is so well known to your viewers, it almost doesn't bear kind of delineating what Donald Trump has said and done on that issue. The third thing is this authoritarian impulse, which I think people define as this kind of undue deference to authoritarian figures or people in uniform like soldiers or police. But I think it means more than that. And in particular, I think the charismatic personality is at the center of the authoritarian impulse. I was struck, I mean, not in a good way, I was struck in a very disturbing way at some of the deep resonances between what we're seeing lately at Donald Trump's rallies and what we saw with the Nazi rallies. Just the kind of air of menace and unpredictability and the promise of unleashing mayhem in order to restore what they regard as order. These are really troubling. They're really troubling similarities.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that. We're talking with historian Kathleen Frydl about fascism and Donald Trump. It seems to me it's not traditionally used in the definitions of fascism, but it seems to me that another parallel is the transmutation of sort of unformed anger, generalized anger, into specified, focused rage and physical violence. It seems to me, whether it was, Kristallnacht during the rise of Hitler, or the beating of protesters at Trump rallies, the idea that you can give flesh to those to the things that are bothering you. It is these people. Go beat them up. It seems to me that's part of the whole phenomenon too. What do you think of that?
That's beautifully put, and I very much endorse it. I was, in preparation of writing this piece and a piece I wrote before it on the media and Donald Trump, I reread Thomas Mann's Mario and the Magician, and it makes precisely that point. It's an allegorical story of the rise of fascism in Europe, and it was written, I believe, in the early 1930s. And the magician on stage is able to embody or incarnate the kind of inchoate resentments, almost unnamed resentments of the audience, and produce electrifying and horrifying results. It's a piece that is neglected, I think, in fascist studies, but it's one that maybe we should all be reading today.
Yeah, that's a great find and a great link to make. We're talking with historian Kathleen Frydl. So basically, I guess the only other question I might ask you about this, and maybe we'll talk about a little bit about how the media is covering Trump, but is now like the ghost of the protagonist of the Christmas Carol says to the ghost of Christmas future, are these things that must be or things that may be only? Is Donald Trump inevitably, should he become president, the face of a future fascism, or is he only a fascist in potential and it could go any number of different ways?
Well, I hope the latter, and I'm sure you do too. We are in a very different position than the Weimar Republic was in the late 1920s. The people who have dismissed the fascist comparison tend to point out the weak democratic tradition within the Weimar Republic and the vulnerability of its institutions to manipulation. I don't find that to be the strongest case because, in particular, with the media, what's been horrifying is how successfully Donald Trump has been able to manipulate democratic institutions and our national life. What I personally take a lot more from, a lot more heart from, is our native diversity. And the strength of the progressive coalition. I mean, we are in a different place than the Weimar Republic was. The Weimar Republic was a lot more homogeneous than we are. It was, the traditions of dissent were not as firmly embedded. So we have a lot of things that we can draw upon to counter the growing influence of Donald Trump. But I do very much hope that this piece is one among many that serves as a call to arms, because complacency will not defeat Donald Trump.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And I guess I would add to that I think sometimes many of us, including our academic brethren and sisters, sometimes overestimate. I don't want to be harsh and call it a form of American exceptionalism, but I think that sometimes we tend to get overly sanguine about the strength of our own institutions, even as we see some of them fraying. Is the right to vote is challenged in many parts of the country. Democracy is certainly struggling in certain parts of the country and in certain ways right now. The press is now, we can talk about the press for a couple minutes, but it can certainly be argued that we're not getting the full story from the corporate press, the corporate media. So I wonder sometimes if we don't sometimes overestimate the strength, given everything you said about the differences, which I agree with, I wonder if we sometimes don't overestimate the strength of our own institutions.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think this notion of American exceptionalism has to be placed within a global framework in which we have actually seen fascists come to power lately. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is something we've seen lately. We saw it in my parents' homeland, which was once called Czechoslovakia, and the Slovakia part of that has recently put fascists. I mean, they are self-declared fascists in government. In Poland and in Hungary, they're not self-declared fascists, but the trends are very troubling, and the analogies are there. So what we're seeing happening in the United States, and I take your point that our institutions are not the bulwarks that we think they are, but in addition to that, I would also just add, contrary to American exceptionalism, what we're seeing here and this kind of backlash, a fascist backlash to the policies of globalization, is something that's been playing out worldwide for some time.
Yeah, and I worked in both Czechoslovakia and Hungary during the transition over from communism, and I can tell you, I remember quite vividly seeing the first signs of that extreme nationalism and nativism start to appear in certain parts of the country, especially Hungary, and the return of certain code words like cosmopolitan for religious minorities and so on, Jews in particular. So I don't think we can afford to be sanguine here or anywhere else. I mean, that's my personal opinion. Even though we are not as culturally homogenous as Slovakia or Hungary or Germany. But we got about a minute left, Kathleen Frydl. Is the press, where is the press, if at all, falling down in covering this phenomenon in particular?
The Mon story I referenced communicates to us quite clearly that, among other things, fascism is a performance. And those who are culpable in it include those who are giving him a stage.
Mm.
And I've said this for a long time, and I wonder if you guys would agree that the real bias in the media is not liberal or conservative. The real bias is in favor of the superficial. And what I feel like is the interviews we see with Trump are not, in fact, interviews. I mean, there's no, and we haven't seen genuine interviews except for, in isolated pockets of journalism. We haven't seen actual interviews on the news for some time. These things are public relations performances. And Donald Trump has come on the scene and exploited that, and he's turned them into spectacles, even engaging spectacles. The lack of substance, the lack of follow up, the lack of contextualizing an answer and producing a really rigorous response. These things have been absent long before Donald Trump appeared on the scene.
Well, it's a provocative theory. It's Trump as Hitler and CBS as his Leni Riefenstahl. But I guess I would say to that, my reaction is yes, with the proviso that I often see things through an economic lens, and that it is as Les Moonves at CBS has said, and I will continue to repeat, he is openly acknowledging that covering Trump is in their financial interest. So if the superficial sells, they will sell the superficial at whatever risk to the country. And unfortunately, I think we're pretty much going to have to leave it there. But you've also written a piece on the increasingly irrelevant corporate media at Huffington Post, as well as Sorry Folks, It's Fascism, also at the Huffington Post. So Kathleen Frydl, historian, thanks so much. It's always great to talk to you.
Thanks, you guys.